Welcome to the CIO Evolution. In this podcast, we'll explore the Chief Information Officer's role in executing a new ongoing leadership imperative, digital transformation that promotes agility and resilience. How do CIOs upgrade legacy networks? What are the financial challenges CIOs face? And what are the security measures that are required in the new work from anywhere, mobile and cloud-based world?
Welcome everyone to episode 13 of the CIO Evolution podcast series. I'm Christoph Heidler. I'm the guest host working for Zscaler as VP Global Transformation Strategy and also CIO EMEA. Prior to joining Zscaler, I've been CIO of a number of companies. I've also been on the board of a few companies, and as such, the topic of security and how the role of a CISO has developed in the last years is of greatest interest to me, and I hope also to you. And I'm very happy to welcome Simon Hodgkinson to our podcast today. Simon, I would have introduced you as the former CISO of BP because that's how I got to know you a year ago. But in the meantime, I read on LinkedIn and other places that you do much more. I mean, obviously, you have left BP, and since you developed further and have a number of other roles. So, Simon, probably best you introduce yourself to the audience.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christoph. I guess I'm a career IT person, so I've done 35 plus years in IT. And my last corporate role was Chief Information Security Officer at BP. I did that for 4 years, and prior to that, I ran global infrastructure and operations for BP. Now I've moved to roles where I have no operational accountability at all, and I do advisory roles for a number of software companies and services companies, including Zscaler. I also act as a chief operating officer for a not-for-profit organization called TransInCity, which focuses on inclusion, and that's a real big passion of mine.
Great. Thanks, Simon. You said you moved away from operations. Are you missing your phone ringing during nights or weekends?
Not in the slightest, Christoph. And as you might imagine, there's calls come through about, would you like to do an interim role? And I'm very clear that I do not want to go back to the world where I'm being woken up in the middle of the night about some particular attack on our organization. So no, I'm very happy.
I see. But obviously, I mean, you do have the experience, and there's a lot you can tell. But what I'm really particularly interested is in, I mean, we live in very unpredictable times, right? And we have seen that with COVID, obviously, the chip crisis, the war, the disruption of supply chain, things are constantly changing. Now, not only your personal development, you said you moved on, has changed, but I think also the role of security, and in particular the role of the CISO in a company, has changed in recent times. Can you talk a bit about your observation, how things have changed, and whether it's specific due to the pandemic and the other crises we had, or if it's a general move in the industry that IT security is taking a different attention, is getting a different attention, is going up to the board level?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think probably the most significant change is just the profile. So if you think about over the last decade, the Chief Information Security Officer was probably called head of security and embedded under the infrastructure or the CIO organization, because of the profile of cyber risk and the fact that businesses, hopefully most businesses, recognize cyber as being one of their top risks. The role of the CISO has just become much more high profile, and now you often see the CISO as a peer to the CIO or the Chief Digital Officer or the Chief Technology Officer. And the CISO tends to get a lot more time with the executive team and the board because of the sheer size of the risk to business operations. I think thinking back, there were a couple of incidents, of course, that really amplified that. Probably the most notable one was NotPetya and WannaCry. They're still used quite extensively in narratives about what could happen, and they are still very appropriate. But in those events, of course, some very significant brands were unable to deliver any of their business. And more recently, we saw the effect of a ransomware attack on something like Colonial Pipeline, where they essentially shut down their production operations because of a ransomware attack. And I think that's, the business really now recognize this isn't a technical risk at all. This is all about the business's ability to have an operationally resilient environment, and hence the CISO role has grown in profile.
No, I definitely agree, and I have absolutely the same observation that the head of security in the past was part of the infrastructure team, all reporting to the CIO, and now seems to be on the same level. Sometimes even in a different reporting structure, reporting straight into the operational board, the board of directors, or even having a more governance role, which I think is also linked to the increasing fear to fail on regulations. I mean, we all got involved years ago when GDPR came up. Now we hear discussions about Schrems. What's your view there? Is it more, or maybe it's equally the same, but is it because of the risk that companies see in cybersecurity and the threat that is in it, or is it also linked to regulations and obviously failing on GDPR, failing on other regulations? We all know it can be fairly expensive. So how you see this play together?
Yeah, the role, it's a great question actually, because the role of the CISO does vary quite considerably depending on the organization that they sit in. Some take a really, if you think about 3 lines of defense, so your basic operations, your assurance functions, and audit. Some cybersecurity organization do operations and assurance. Some of the organizations just do assurance. And so there isn't a one size fits all model. I think regulation, however, has really kind of amplified again the role of the CISO in providing that assurance. And you touched particularly on GDPR and Schrems. Having worked for BP that operated in 80 countries, you could pick any number of those countries and they'll all have their own cyber regulation that they're implementing. So in the US, for instance, you obviously got the California Act, the CCPA. In India, you've got their privacy regulations, which look pretty similar to GDPR, with similar sort of fine regimes that go around that. But you could pick any country, and everybody is moving to that more regulated world around data privacy in particular. And that's a big challenge for global organizations. And you also touched on Schrems, so the sharing of data outside of the EU. That is a huge challenge to global organizations. Some were already dealing with that through things like binding corporate rules, but for others, it's a big new challenge that data sharing is having. There was a great book written many years ago by a guy called Thomas Friedman, and it was called The World is Flat, and it was about the globalization of the economy. Actually, what I'm seeing now is more and more isolationism in terms of that sort of cyber world, which frankly makes it increasingly difficult for global organizations to operate efficiently and effectively and still within the different regulatory regimes in which they operate.
You're right. There are so many regulations, and I probably mentioned only a few, and you mentioned a lot more. But is there I mean, it's hard to believe that one CISO can know all of them and can stay on top of all of them. Is there any advice you want to give on how to stay on top of this, how to deal with the various regulations? I mean, is there any good, smart way that you can propose?
Well, honestly, for me, it was having a brilliant legal team. People that were constantly monitoring the evolution of the landscape and working closely with my governance, risk and compliance organization to make sure that we were always ahead of the next change in regulation. But I was, frankly, Christoph, I was blessed to work for a big organization where we had resources we could deploy for it. So for many smaller organizations, I think it is a bigger challenge.
With cybersecurity now being topic on a different level, being at the board level, the executive or non-executive board level, that meant to you and that means to the other CISOs to speak a different language, right? There are different expectations on this level in terms of communication, in terms of reporting, in terms of explaining risks. What have you seen there? What is your advice and what have you seen work on this level? Because obviously, like we said, you come from a very, not you, but the CISO comes from a very operational IT infrastructure level and now elevates in a different role. And as I said, you have to learn to speak a different language, to explain yourself different, to satisfy other reporting requirements. What have you seen work on these management levels?
I think the main thing is the narrative has to connect to the audience, and I think that's probably true of any forum which you share, you speak or you share content with people. So within the board, we needed to make sure that we talked about cyber in context of the business. So what was the business outcomes we were trying to achieve? And how did the cyber risk relate to the ability of the business to achieve those outcomes? So rather than run around and talk about, the sky's falling in and, there's all of these attacks, which of course we clearly needed to use that data to inform people about what was happening. We also needed to change the narrative around the risk to talk about actually cyber could cause a major accident on an operating platform. So for BP, you think, the horrific events of Gulf of Mexico, and the trigger for that could have been a cyber attack on the OT systems. It wasn't, of course, but it's changing that narrative to make sure that you connect to the business. One of the examples was when we got to the point where the cyber risk to our operational platforms was actually at the same level as a major accident risk for those platforms. So people then really understood about the potential consequences of a cyber attack in that environment. And, I used to go to a number of committees. I used to go to the Audit and Risk Committee to talk about cybersecurity, and I used to go to the Safety Committee to talk about cybersecurity from an operational technology perspective, because the business really understood there was your traditional cyber risk to the enterprise IT platform and the potential of disruption to business operations or loss of data, but also importantly that there was this potential for the operations technology networks to be attacked, causing a safety or a major accident in those environments.
Great answer. We've spoken a lot about what to do, what not to do, and the processes and the approach to it. But I've seen recently, and maybe it's been there before, but I've just recently seen a number of articles around it where companies go as far as linking the executive's performance against the ability to manage cyber risk in the company, as far as going to link the entire executive bonus to it. What's your view there? I mean, is that a reasonable approach?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, cyber is just another risk. we sort of, in some respects, things like NotPetya and the devastating impact that had on organizations like Maersk, as I said, really raised the profile. But it raised the profile where people tended to look to the CIO or the CISO to own that risk. So I think the first thing organizations need to do is really to make it clear that the accountability for cyber risks sits with the business leadership. The accountability doesn't sit with the CISO or indeed the CIO, so that they really recognize that this is in the same way as your managed safety risk or financial risk, it's managed as a general operational risk and is not seen as special. And of course, the board holds the executive team to account through the oversight they do on effective risk management. So, part of effective risk management is ensuring that you understand the cyber risk, you take appropriate mitigating actions to get to a level where the risk posture is appropriate to the business you're running. So in many respects, I think it does already link to executive performance through the whole risk management lens. I think there is a nuance with cyber in some respects that makes it, again, a little bit special, and that is most risks for businesses are either geographically constrained or constrained to a particular business segment. The difference with cyber risk is it tends to be borderless and boundaryless. So, it often isn't an isolated, say, an impact to a business in the US. If somebody gets hit with ransomware, it tends to take the entire business down. And therefore, the type of risk management you need to put in place needs to be appropriate to the potential worst case scale of that risk.
I fully agree, and I think you're right. It's not the only risk, so you might be a bit tactical in my eyes of some companies to putting money against it to get faster outcomes. I don't know if you've seen, we recently announced that, as we obviously see a lot what's happening at our customers, that in our product we will enhance reporting capabilities and will show a dashboard showing your evaluation of your risk score. Did you have any chance to look at this?
So I've read about it. I haven't looked at it in detail. I'd kind of love to do that. But, we historically back at BP, we were looking at things like Microsoft Security Score as a way of measuring the risk to the things that Microsoft could see in terms of the landscape that they manage. So I think they're good because actually it gives you a kind of maturity assessment of where you are today. Therefore, you're able to kind of decide whether you need to get better. And that's data focus. One of the challenges in cyber is quantifying cyber risk. So back to the point about you could lose your entire business. What value do you put on that? It tends to be quite much easier to value a small part of the business, but the notion of losing everything, what is the value at risk about that? And how do you make that sensible in terms of your risk quantification? Things like Zscaler are producing is fantastic. That gives the CISO more data, quantitative metrics that show more about your cybersecurity posture is a good thing.
Simon, I think we could talk for hours, but looking at the time, we probably have to come to an end. Typical ending question, Simon. Any final advice, any final direction you want to give to leaders, to IT, cybersecurity, CXOs in the space of IT and digitization?
Assume the worst is going to happen. Back to my point about this is a business risk. If I was only allowed one thing, it would be make sure you exercise from the CEO, from the board down through the organization, that you are ready and prepared that if you get hit by a cyber attack, that everything from your legal, your communications, your HR functions, your business leadership functions have been engaged in an exercise to understand how you would manage through that particular scenario, because sadly most organizations either have or will be hit by a reasonably significant cyber attack at some point in their lifetime.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much for spending time with me, spending time with us today. And of course, thank you to the listeners for tuning in. Hope to see you soon again.
Thanks, Christoph.
Thanks for listening to the CIO Evolution. Check back with your podcast provider regularly for more episodes. You can find more episodes along with other podcasts on the CXO REvolutionary's website at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Statements by Zscaler podcasters and guests are informational only and should never be construed as legal advice. You should consult your legal advisor on matters related to you or your business. Zscaler makes no warranties, express, implied, or statutory as to the content of this podcast, and it is provided as is. Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of the recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Copyright 2021.